The carriage had barely stopped when a hand closed around Eleanor Whitmore's wrist. She gasped and turned, startled by the grip, and found herself staring into a pair of gray eyes so cold they seemed carved from winter stone. The man standing before her was tall, dressed in dark traveling clothes, his jaw tight with anger he did not bother to hide. "Where did you get that necklace?" he demanded. Eleanor's free hand flew to her throat, to the small gold chain and the pale blue stone that hung from it. It was the only thing of value she owned, the one piece of her mother she had left. She had worn it every day since her mother's passing, and never once had a stranger looked at it with such fury. "Sir, you are hurting my arm," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. He did not let go. "Answer me. Where did you get it?" Around them, the courtyard of Blackthorne Hall had gone silent. A groom stood frozen with a horse's reins in his hand. Two maids paused on the front steps, baskets of linen forgotten in their arms. Eleanor felt every eye turn toward her, and heat rushed into her cheeks. "It belonged to my mother," she said. "She left it to me when she died. I do not know what business it is of yours." "It is very much my business." His voice dropped, quieter now but no less hard. "That necklace belonged to my sister." For a moment, Eleanor could not speak. The words made no sense to her. She had worn this necklace for 3 years, ever since her mother's death, and never once had anyone questioned where it came from. Her mother had told her it was a family piece, nothing more. "You are mistaken," she said. "This was my mother's. She wore it long before I was born." "I know every stone my family has ever owned," he said. "That sapphire was cut for my sister Margaret on the day she turned 16. I would know it anywhere, on anyone, in any light." Eleanor pulled her wrist free at last, stepping back until she felt the cold stone of the entrance wall against her shoulder. Her heart was pounding so hard she thought he must surely hear it. She had come to Blackthorne Hall that very morning, sent by an agency in London to take up a position mending linens and gowns for the household. She had expected perhaps a brief meeting with a housekeeper, a small room in the servants' wing, quiet work to fill her days. She had not expected to be accused of theft before she had even crossed the threshold. "I am not a thief," she said, and to her own surprise, her voice did not shake. "I do not know your sister. I do not know how this necklace came into my mother's hands, but it was hers, and now it is mine, and I have done nothing wrong." The man studied her for a long moment. He was younger than she had first thought, though grief had carved lines at the corners of his mouth that did not belong on a man of his years. His dark hair was pushed back carelessly, as though he had run his hands through it too many times that day. He wore the clothes of a gentleman who had traveled far and fast, dust still clinging to his boots. "Who are you?" he asked finally. "Eleanor Whitmore. I was sent by Mrs. Ashensie in London." "I believe I am expected." Something flickered across his face, there and gone before she could name it. He turned to the housekeeper, a stout woman who had just hurried out from the side door, her cap slightly crooked from rushing. "Mrs. Fairweather," he said. "Is this the seamstress we sent for?" "Yes, Your Grace. Miss Whitmore, come from London this very morning." "Your Grace." The words struck Eleanor like a splash of cold water. She had not known. No one had told her the man who owned Blackthorne Hall would be present, let alone that he would seize her by the wrist within moments of her arrival. She dropped into a hurried curtsy, though her legs felt unsteady beneath her skirts. "Forgive me, Your Grace. I did not know who you were." "That hardly matters now," he said. "What matters is that you are wearing a necklace that was buried with my sister 4 years ago." The courtyard seemed to tilt beneath Eleanor's feet. Buried with his sister. If that were true, then the necklace around her neck should not exist at all, unless someone had taken it from a grave, or unless the Duke was simply wrong. Neither thought brought her any comfort. "That cannot be," she whispered. "My mother wore this necklace before I was born. She gave it to me herself, on her deathbed, 3 years past. I have had it every day since. I do not understand how it could be the same one." "Nor do I," the Duke said. "Which is precisely why you will not be leaving Blackthorne Hall until I understand it." Mrs. Fairweather's eyes went wide. "Your Grace, surely there is some simple explanation. The poor girl only just arrived." "Then she will have ample time to explain herself." He turned back to Eleanor, and for the first time she saw something beneath the anger, something raw and unhealed, like a wound that had never properly closed. "You will keep your position here, Miss Whitmore, for now, but you will not remove that necklace, and you will not leave these grounds without my knowledge. Do you understand?" Eleanor wanted to protest, wanted to demand what right he had to command her so, a woman he had known for less than a quarter hour. But something in his eyes stopped her. It was not only suspicion she saw there. It was grief, deep and old. the kind that never fully left a person once it had taken root. "I understand," she said quietly. He gave a short nod, then turned and strode into the house without another word, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the courtyard, with her heart still racing and her hand still pressed against the necklace at her throat. Mrs. Fairweather hurried to her side, her expression a mixture of pity and worry. "Come, dear. Let us get you settled. Pay him no mind. He has not been himself since he returned from the continent." "What happened to his sister?" Eleanor asked, unable to hold the question back. Mrs. Fairweather's face grew pale, and she glanced toward the house as though afraid the walls themselves might carry her words back to the Duke. "That is not a story for the courtyard, Miss Whitmore. Come inside. There is much you will need to learn about this house, and precious little of it is happy." Eleanor followed her through the great doors, casting one last glance behind her at the courtyard where, only minutes before, her life had been a simple thing, uncomplicated by dukes or dead sisters or necklaces that seemed to carry secrets she had never asked to inherit. The hall stretched before her, grand and shadowed, portraits lining the walls, their painted eyes seeming to follow her every step. Somewhere in this house, she thought, was the truth about her mother, about the necklace, and about a girl named Margaret who had died far too young. She did not know yet whether she wanted to find it. Inside, the housekeeper led her down a long corridor toward the servants' stairs, speaking in a low, hurried voice about linens and mealtimes and the rules of the house, but Eleanor heard little of it. Her mind kept circling back to the Duke's face, to the fury that had burned there, and beneath it, something far more fragile. She had seen grief before. She had lived inside it since her mother's death. She recognized it now in a stranger's eyes, and despite everything, despite the humiliation of the courtyard and the fear still coiled in her chest, she found herself wondering what had truly happened to the girl who once wore this same necklace, and how her own mother had come to carry it after her. The corridor turned, and Mrs. Fairweather paused before a narrow door. "This will be your room, Miss Whitmore. Small, but warm enough. Supper is at 6. And Miss Whitmore," she added, her voice dropping lower still, "whatever His Grace said to you, I would advise you to be careful. He is not a cruel man, not truly. But he has not smiled once since he came home, and I fear this house holds more sorrow than any of us know." Eleanor nodded, though the words offered little comfort. She stepped into the small room, closed the door behind her, and sat upon the narrow bed, her fingers still resting against the necklace at her throat. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the window in its frame, and somewhere far off in the house, she thought she heard the faint sound of a door closing, heavy and final, like the closing of an old wound that had never truly healed. A soft knock came at her door before she could gather her thoughts. A young maid peeked inside, no older than 16, with a round, friendly face and flour dusted across her apron. "Miss Whitmore, I am Polly. Mrs. Fairweather sent me to bring you water for washing, and to see that you have everything you need." "Thank you, Polly." Eleanor tried to smile, though her hands still trembled faintly in her lap. Polly set down the basin and lingered by the door, curiosity plain on her young face. "Is it true, miss, what they are saying below stairs, that His Grace stopped you in the courtyard over a necklace?" Eleanor's fingers rose again to the chain at her throat, an instinct she could not seem to stop. "News travels quickly in this house." "Everything travels quickly here, miss. There is little else to talk about, since His Grace came home so changed." Polly lowered her voice, glancing toward the door as though the walls themselves might listen. "He used to laugh, they say, before his sister died. Now he walks these halls like a man haunted." "What was she like, Lady Margaret?" Polly's expression softened. "I never knew her myself, miss. I only came into service last year, but the older staff speak of her fondly. Kind, they say, full of light. It broke something in this family when she passed, and no one has ever spoken plainly of how it happened, not even Mrs. Fairweather, and she knows most everything." The maid excused herself soon after, leaving Eleanor alone with her thoughts and the slowly cooling water in the basin. She washed the dust of the road from her hands and face, then sat by the narrow window, watching the last gray light fade over the gardens below. Rows of hedges stretched into the distance, neatly trimmed, and beyond them she could just make out the shape of a small stone building, half hidden by ivy, that looked as though it had not been visited in a very long time. She thought of her mother then, of the quiet woman who had raised her alone in a small cottage 2 counties away, who had never spoken of grand houses or dukes or dead girls with sapphire necklaces. Her mother had been a seamstress too, skilled with a needle, gentle in her manner, and utterly silent about her past. Eleanor had always assumed there was simply nothing to tell. Now she wondered if her mother's silence had been a door kept deliberately closed. When the supper bell rang at last, Eleanor made her way down to the servants' hall, where long tables were already filling with staff of every rank, from grooms to footmen to the cook herself, a broad woman with flushed cheeks and flowers still in her hair. Conversation quieted slightly as Eleanor entered, heads turning, whispers passing behind raised hands. She took a seat near the end of the table, beside Polly, and kept her eyes on her plate. "Do not mind them," Polly whispered. "They will forget soon enough, once something else happens to gossip about." But something told Eleanor that would not be true, not while the necklace remained around her neck, and not while the Duke's cold gray eyes continued to haunt the edges of her thoughts. She did not know, not yet, that the necklace around her neck would unravel a secret that had been buried for 4 long years, a secret that would change everything she believed about her mother, about the Duke of Blackthorne, and about herself. 3 days passed before the Duke of Blackthorne spoke to Eleanor again, and in that time, she learned more about Lady Margaret Ashford than she had ever expected to know. It began with a portrait. Eleanor had been sent to the long gallery on the 2nd floor to mend a torn curtain, and it was there, among rows of solemn painted faces, that she found her. The portrait was smaller than the others, tucked near the end of the row as though someone could not decide whether to display it proudly or hide it away entirely. A young woman with dark hair and gray eyes so like the Duke's own gazed out from the canvas, a faint smile touching her lips, and around her throat hung a necklace Eleanor knew all too well. She stood frozen before it, her needle and thread forgotten in her hands. That was painted the year before she died. Eleanor spun around to find Mrs. Fairweather standing behind her, a stack of folded linens balanced against her hip. The housekeeper's eyes went to the portrait, then to the necklace at Eleanor's throat, and something like sorrow passed over her face. "She was lovely," Eleanor said softly. "She was more than lovely, Miss Whitmore. She was the light of this house. His Grace, when he was younger, before he took on the title, before all this weight settled on his shoulders, he used to laugh more in a single afternoon with her than he has in the 4 years since she passed." Mrs. Fairweather set down her linens on a nearby chair, as though the memory required both her hands free. Lady Margaret loved music. She loved dancing. She would sneak down to the kitchens at night and beg the cook for sweets, and not one of us ever had the heart to refuse her. "How did she die?" Eleanor asked, though she feared the answer. Mrs. Fairweather's expression closed like a door shutting. "That is not mine to tell, miss. It is not spoken of in this house, not by staff, and certainly not in His Grace's hearing. All I will say is that it was sudden, and it was cruel, and it left a wound in this family that has never healed." She gathered her linens once more and turned to leave, but paused at the gallery door. "The necklace you wear, Miss Whitmore, I do not know how it came to your mother, but I would be careful who you speak to about it. There are those in this house who loved Lady Margaret so dearly that grief has made them suspicious of shadows, His Grace among them." Eleanor spent the rest of that afternoon lost in thought, her hands moving through the motions of her work, while her mind wandered elsewhere entirely. She thought of her mother, of the quiet cottage where she had grown up, of the long hours her mother had spent bent over her sewing by candlelight, humming softly to herself, never once speaking of any grand house or noble family. Had her mother known Lady Margaret? Had she perhaps served here, at Blackthorne Hall, before Eleanor was born? It would explain so much, and yet it explained nothing at all. For if her mother had once worked in this house, why had she never spoken of it? Why had she left so suddenly, and settled so far away, and kept the past locked so tightly behind her? That evening, as Eleanor made her way back toward the servants' wing, a voice stopped her in the corridor. "Miss Whitmore." She turned to find the Duke standing near the base of the great staircase, a single candle in his hand, its light throwing long shadows across the sharp planes of his face. He looked, she thought, as though he had not slept properly in days. Dark circles shadowed his eyes, and his cravat had been loosened, as if he had tugged at it in frustration more than once that evening. "Your Grace." She dropped into a small curtsy, her heart quickening despite herself. "I have made inquiries," he said, "about the agency that sent you here. About your mother's history, I intend to learn the truth of that necklace, one way or another." "I have told you the truth already," Eleanor said, and though her voice remained steady, she felt a flicker of frustration rise in her chest. "My mother wore it before I was born. She was a seamstress, much as I am. She never once mentioned Blackthorne Hall, or your sister, or any family so grand as yours." "Then how do you explain it?" His voice was not cruel, not tonight, but there was an edge of desperation beneath the demand that surprised her. "That necklace was placed in my sister's coffin with my own hands. I watched it lowered into the ground. I have thought of little else these 4 years but her face, and the moment I saw that same stone at your throat, I thought for one terrible instant that I had imagined the whole of her death, that somehow, impossibly, she had returned to me." The candle flame trembled between them, and for the first time, Eleanor saw past the anger entirely, saw the raw and desperate hope that had flared and died in his eyes the moment he realized she was not his sister, would never be his sister, and that the mystery of the necklace remained as unsolved as ever. "I am sorry," she said quietly. "I did not mean to remind you of her in such a painful way." "You did not choose to wear a necklace that should be 6 feet underground," he said, though the harshness had gone out of his voice entirely now. "That fault, if fault there is, belongs to whoever placed it in your mother's hands. Perhaps it was never truly buried at all," Eleanor offered carefully. "Perhaps someone kept it, for reasons of their own, and it passed to my mother through some path neither of us yet understands." The Duke was silent for a long moment, studying her face in the candlelight as though searching for answers written somewhere in her features. "You speak sense," he admitted finally. "More sense than I have allowed myself these past 3 days. I have been so consumed by my own grief that I forgot grief is not proof of guilt." "No," Eleanor agreed softly, "it is only proof of love." Something shifted in his expression then, something she could not quite name, and for a heartbeat, the corridor felt very small, the candlelight very warm, the distance between a duke and a seamstress far less vast than it had seemed only days before. "Tell me of your mother," he said suddenly. "Her name, where she lived, before you were born, anything you remember of her life before your own memories begin." "Her name was Catherine," Eleanor said. "Catherine Whitmore, though I do not know if Whitmore was the name she was born with, or one she took later in life. She never spoke of it, and I never thought to ask, not until it was too late to do so." The Duke's face changed at the mention of the name, a flicker of something like recognition passing swiftly across his features before he could mask it. "Catherine," he repeated quietly, almost to himself. "Your Grace? Do you know that name?" He did not answer at once. Instead, he turned toward the window at the end of the corridor, where the last light of evening had faded into deep blue dusk, and for a long moment he said nothing at all, lost in some memory Eleanor could not follow. "There was a woman," he said finally, "who served my mother as a companion, many years ago, before my sister was born. She left the household rather suddenly, under circumstances no one ever fully explained to me. I was too young at the time to understand the whispers among the staff. I have not thought of her in years. I did not think I remembered her name at all, until you spoke it just now." Eleanor's heart began to race. "Was her name Catherine?" "I believe it was," he said slowly, "though I could be mistaken. Memory plays cruel tricks, Miss Whitmore, particularly on those of us who have spent years trying not to remember at all." They stood together in the dim corridor, both caught in the weight of a possibility neither of them had expected, a thread connecting a dead sister, a lost companion, and a necklace that refused to stay buried. "I want to know the truth," Eleanor said finally, "whatever it is. Even if it means learning something about my mother I never wished to know." The Duke studied her a moment longer, and something in his cold gray eyes softened, just slightly, like the first crack of light through a window long kept shuttered. "Then we shall learn it together, Miss Whitmore, starting tomorrow. I will have the old household records brought up from the archive, every ledger, every letter, every name recorded in this house for the last 30 years. If your mother once walked these halls, we will find the proof of it." He turned to go, then paused, glancing back at her with an expression she could not fully read. "And Miss Whitmore, I owe you an apology for the courtyard. I spoke to you as though you were an enemy, when you may in fact hold the key to a mystery that has haunted this family for far longer than you know." "Apology accepted, Your Grace," Eleanor said softly, and watched him disappear up the staircase, his candle casting long shadows against the ancient walls. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, turning the conversation over and over in her mind, until the words began to blur together. Catherine, companion, sister, necklace, each one circling the next, like birds unable to land. When at last she drifted into sleep, she dreamed of her mother's cottage, of candlelight and the soft scratch of a needle through cloth, and somewhere in the dream, a young woman with dark hair stood in the doorway, smiling, a sapphire stone bright at her throat. She woke before dawn, her heart pounding, the dream already dissolving at the edges like mist under morning sun. The following day brought little rest from her thoughts, for word of the Duke's request had apparently traveled fast among the staff, and by mid-morning, half the household seemed to know that old ledgers were being carried up from the estate archive on his orders. Polly found her in the linen room, eyes bright with curiosity. "They say His Grace wants every record in the house searched," Polly whispered, setting down a basket of mending. "Old wage books, letters, everything going back 30 years or more. Mrs. Fairweather has been in estate all morning, pulling dusty boxes down from the attic storerooms. Do you know why?" Eleanor asked carefully, though she already knew the answer. Polly shrugged. "No one will say plainly, but I heard Mrs. Fairweather mention a name to the butler. Catherine, I believe it was. Does that mean anything to you, miss?" Eleanor's needle paused mid-stitch. "It might," she admitted. "It was my mother's name." Polly's eyes widened, but before she could ask further questions, the bell rang, summoning them both back to their duties, and Eleanor was left once more with her thoughts as company, threading and mending, while her mind wandered far from the cloth in her hands. That afternoon, she was sent to the archive room herself, ostensibly to assist in sorting old linens that had been stored alongside the estate ledgers, though she suspected Mrs. Fairweather had arranged the errand deliberately, sensing perhaps that Eleanor deserved to see for herself what the old records might reveal. The room was small and cramped, lit by a single high window, its air thick with dust and the smell of aged paper. Boxes lined every wall, some so old their labels had faded to illegible smudges. She found the housekeeper there, bent over a stack of leather-bound ledgers, her spectacles perched low on her nose. "Miss Whitmore, come, make yourself useful. These wage books go back further than my own memory. If your mother served here, her name will be recorded somewhere among these pages, along with her wages and the date she left service." They worked in silence for a time, the only sound the rustle of old paper and the distant creak of the house settling around them. Eleanor's fingers moved carefully over brittle pages filled with faded ink, names she did not recognize, sums of money paid to cooks and grooms and laundry maids long since passed from memory. Her heart quickened with every new page, half hoping and half dreading to see her mother's name appear among the entries. "Here," Mrs. Fairweather said suddenly, her voice sharp with surprise. "Miss Whitmore, come look at this." Eleanor hurried to her side and peered down at the ledger the housekeeper held open before her. There, in faded but legible ink, was an entry from nearly 30 years past, recording the wages of a companion to the late Duchess, the Duke's mother. The name written beside the sum was Catherine Ashworth. "Ashworth," Eleanor whispered, "not Whitmore. Names change, miss, particularly for a woman who marries, or who wishes to leave her past behind her." Mrs. Fairweather's expression had grown solemn. "This entry ends abruptly, see here. No notice given, no proper wages settled for her final month. That is unusual, most unusual indeed. A companion in good standing would never be let go in such a fashion, not without record or reason. What could have happened to her?" Mrs. Fairweather closed the ledger slowly, her weathered hands lingering on its cover. "I do not know, Miss Whitmore, but I begin to suspect that you and I are not the only ones searching for that answer, and that His Grace's interest in these old records runs far deeper than a single necklace." Eleanor looked down at the closed ledger, at the dust still clinging to its edges, and felt the strange, unsettling sensation of standing at the very beginning of a story that had started long before she was born, one that had somehow, improbably, brought her back to the very house where it had first unraveled. A storm broke over Blackthorne Hall 2 nights later, rain lashing the windows so hard that Eleanor woke certain the glass would shatter. She had been sent that evening to deliver a repaired coat to the Duke's study, a small errand that Mrs. Fairweather insisted could wait until morning, though something in the housekeeper's knowing look told Eleanor she had been given the task on purpose. Eleanor climbed the great staircase with the coat folded over her arm, thunder rolling somewhere beyond the hills, and found the study door slightly ajar, firelight flickering warm against the darkened corridor. The Duke sat behind his desk, surrounded by towers of old ledgers and yellowed letters, his sleeves rolled to the elbow, ink staining his fingers. He looked up as she entered, and for a moment, something like relief crossed his face, as though her arrival offered a welcome escape from whatever troubled thoughts had kept him bent over these papers long past the dinner hour. "Miss Whitmore, I did not expect visitors tonight. Mrs. Fairweather asked me to bring your coat, Your Grace. It was torn at the shoulder. I have mended it as best I could." "Thank you." He gestured vaguely toward a chair near the fire. "Sit, if you like. The storm shows no sign of easing, and I would rather not send you back out into that corridor only to have you catch a chill." Eleanor hesitated, aware of how improper it would seem for her to sit in the Duke's private study at such an hour. Yet something in his tired eyes made her reluctant to refuse. She set the coat over the back of a chair and lowered herself carefully into the seat he had offered. the fire warm against her skirts. "You have found something," she said, nodding toward the scattered papers. "In the ledgers." "Fragments," he admitted. "Nothing whole enough to call an answer. Catherine Ashworth served my mother for nearly 4 years, according to the wage books, and then vanished from the record entirely. No notice, no final payment. Nothing but a blank space where her name should continue." He rubbed a hand across his tired eyes. "I have found one letter, half burned, mentioning a scandal my mother wished kept quiet. I cannot make out enough of it to understand what occurred." "May I see it?" He passed the fragment across the desk, and Eleanor took it carefully, tilting it toward the firelight. The paper was brittle, edges charred and crumbling. Most of the ink faded beyond reading. She could make out only scattered words, a name she did not recognize, the phrase "must never be known," and further down, the single word "disgrace." "It is not enough," she murmured, disappointed. "No," he agreed, "but it confirms what I already suspected. Whatever happened to your mother in this house, it was not a simple parting of ways. Someone wished the truth buried, thoroughly enough that 30 years later, we are left piecing together scraps of burnt paper by firelight." Thunder cracked outside, loud enough to rattle the window panes, and Eleanor flinched despite herself. The Duke rose from his desk and crossed to the window, drawing the heavy curtain further closed against the storm. "You are not accustomed to such weather?" he asked, a faint note of gentleness in his voice that had not been there in their earlier conversations. "I grew up in a small cottage, Your Grace. The walls were thin. Storms always sounded louder there than I imagine they do within walls as thick as these. And yet you flinch all the same. Old habits are not so easily broken," she said, managing a small smile. He returned to his seat, though he did not immediately return to the ledgers. Instead, he studied her across the firelit room, his gray eyes thoughtful in a way that made her feel strangely exposed, as though he could read thoughts she had not yet fully formed herself. "May I ask you something, Miss Whitmore?" "Of course, Your Grace." "Do you resent me for the manner in which I greeted you that first day in the courtyard?" Eleanor considered the question carefully before answering. "I was frightened and angry, if I am honest. You accused me of theft before you knew my name. But I have come to understand, I think, that grief does not always leave room for kindness, not at first. That is a more generous answer than I deserve." He leaned back in his chair, the firelight carving deep shadows beneath his eyes. "I have not been a kind man these past 4 years, Miss Whitmore. Not to my staff, not to my tenants, and certainly not to myself. My sister's death broke something in me that I have not managed to repair, and I fear I have made this house a colder place for everyone who lives within it." "What happened to her?" Eleanor asked softly. "If you are willing to tell me." For a long moment she thought he would refuse, would retreat behind the same cold formality that had defined their first encounter, but instead he stared into the fire, his jaw tight, and began to speak in a low, halting voice, as though the words had to be dragged up from somewhere deep and painful. "She was riding home from a neighbor's estate, alone, against my wishes. I had forbidden her from riding out without an escort. There had been talk of highwaymen on the roads that season, but Margaret was headstrong, and she resented my restrictions, and we quarreled bitterly before she left that morning. I told her, God forgive me, I told her she could do as she pleased, that I no longer cared to argue with her." His voice caught, and he paused, gathering himself before continuing. "Her horse returned to the stables that evening without her. We found her 3 hours later, thrown from the saddle, her neck broken, in a ravine not 2 miles from this house. The necklace was gone from her throat when we found her. We assumed it lost somewhere in the fall, though we searched for days and never recovered it. We buried her with an empty chain, and I have spent every day since wondering if our quarrel that morning was the reason she rode too fast, too recklessly, toward whatever fate awaited her on that road." Eleanor's chest ached with the weight of his confession. She had not expected such rawness, such unguarded grief, from a man who had greeted her with nothing but cold suspicion only days before. "It was not your fault," she said quietly. "A quarrel between a brother and sister, however bitter, does not cause a horse to stumble or a road to be treacherous. You cannot know that." "No," she agreed. "But neither can you know the opposite with such certainty that you have spent 4 years punishing yourself for it." He looked at her then, something unguarded in his expression, and for a moment, the distance between Duke and seamstress seemed to dissolve entirely, leaving only 2 people who understood, in their own separate ways, the particular loneliness that grief could carve into a person's life. "You lost your mother 3 years ago," he said. "How did you bear it?" "I am not certain I have, not entirely." Eleanor's fingers found the necklace at her throat. the gesture now so familiar it had become almost unconscious. I kept moving forward because there was nothing else to be done. Grief does not ask permission before it settles into a person's bones, Your Grace. It simply arrives, and stays, and one learns to carry it as best one can. The fire crackled between them, and outside, the storm had begun to soften, thunder rolling further into the distance. They sat in a silence that felt, for the first time since Eleanor's arrival, entirely comfortable. Two strangers bound together by loss, and by the mystery of a necklace that refused to remain buried. "I have decided something," the Duke said finally, breaking the quiet. "What is that, Your Grace?" "I intend to write to the solicitor who handled my mother's affairs before her death. If there is any record of what became of Catherine Ashworth, any settlement made, any correspondence exchanged, he will know of it. And I intend to visit the parish where the burial records are kept, to determine once and for all whether the necklace placed in Margaret's coffin was ever truly hers to begin with, or whether it was somehow substituted before the burial. You believe someone deliberately switched it." "I do not know what to believe anymore, Miss Whitmore. I only know that too many threads have come loose at once for this to be simple coincidence. A companion who vanished without record, a letter speaking of disgrace, deliberately burned. A necklace that should be buried in consecrated ground, worn instead by a woman who arrived at my door only days ago, carrying a name I once knew and had long forgotten." He shook his head slowly. "There is a truth buried somewhere in all of this, and I intend to find it, whatever the cost." Eleanor rose from her chair as the mantel clock struck the late hour, aware suddenly of how long she had lingered in the Duke's study, how far the conversation had wandered from its simple beginning as an errand to deliver a mended coat. "I should return to my room, Your Grace. It grows late." He stood as well, walking her to the study door, and paused there, his hand resting lightly against the frame. "Miss Whitmore, thank you, for your honesty tonight, and for your patience with a man who greeted you so poorly upon your arrival. We are both searching for the same truth, Your Grace. I think that makes us allies, whatever else we may be." Something in his expression shifted at her words, warm and unguarded in a way she had not seen before, and for a brief suspended moment, neither of them spoke, the space between them charged with something neither was yet prepared to name. "Good night, Miss Whitmore," he said finally, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "Good night, Your Grace." She made her way back through the darkened corridors, toward the servants' wing, the storm now fading into a gentle patter of rain against the windows, her thoughts a tangle of grief and hope, and something else entirely, something she was not yet ready to examine too closely. Behind her, she knew, the Duke remained in his study, surrounded by burnt letters and broken ledgers, chasing the same ghost that had followed her all the way from her mother's quiet cottage to the grand shadowed halls of Blackthorne. Neither of them slept easily that night, though for very different reasons. The following morning brought a change in the weather, the storm having washed the sky clean, sunlight spilling bright and clear across the gardens below Eleanor's window. She rose early, her mind still full of the previous night's conversation, and made her way down to the servants' hall for breakfast, finding the household already astir with unusual energy. "A visitor is expected," Polly explained, setting bowls of porridge along the table with practiced speed. "Mr. Charles Whitfield, His Grace's cousin. He arrives before noon, or so the message said." "Is that unusual?" Eleanor asked. Polly's expression grew careful, the way it always did when she chose her words with more caution than usual. "Mr. Whitfield does not visit often, miss, and when he does, it is rarely for pleasant reasons. He stands to inherit Blackthorne should anything befall His Grace, seeing as His Grace has no children of his own, and no wife besides. There is little love lost between the two of them, if the staff are to be believed." Eleanor considered this new piece of information as she finished her breakfast, wondering what business could bring such a visitor to the house at precisely the moment when old secrets had begun stirring after decades of silence. She did not have long to wonder, for by mid-morning a carriage rattled up the drive, and from her position near the linen room window, Eleanor watched a tall, fair-haired man step down, his clothes fashionable in a way that seemed almost deliberately at odds with the quiet solemnity of the household. She was sent that afternoon to deliver freshly pressed linens to the guest chambers, and it was there, in the corridor outside Mr. Whitfield's rooms, that she encountered him for the first time. He looked up as she approached, his pale eyes traveling over her with an assessing coolness that made her skin prickle with unease. "You must be the seamstress everyone is whispering about," he said, before she could offer any greeting. "The one wearing my late cousin's necklace." Eleanor's grip tightened on the linens in her arms. "I did not realize the matter had traveled so far, sir. Servants gossip, Miss Whitmore, is it? And cousins listen. particularly when the gossip concerns matters of inheritance and old family scandal. He stepped closer, his smile thin and unpleasant. "Tell me, did you seek this position deliberately? Once you learned what that necklace might be worth to a man desperate enough to believe his sister had somehow returned to him?" "I did not know whose necklace it was until the moment His Grace accused me of theft in the courtyard," Eleanor said, keeping her voice level despite the anger rising in her chest. "I have no interest in Blackthorne's fortune, sir, only in understanding how my late mother came to possess a piece of jewelry belonging to a family I had never heard of before this week." "How convenient," Whitfield murmured, "that your mother's mysterious past should lead precisely to the one house where such a claim might prove so profitable." "I have made no claim, sir, beyond the truth." He studied her a moment longer, something calculating behind his pale eyes, before offering a shallow bow and continuing down the corridor without another word. Eleanor stood frozen for a long moment after he had gone, her heart pounding with a fresh unease that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the distinct sense that Mr. Charles Whitfield saw her not as a mystery to be solved, but as a threat to be managed. She mentioned the encounter to Mrs. Fairweather later that evening, and the housekeeper's face grew grim as she listened. "Mr. Whitfield has always resented his position, Miss Whitmore. Close enough to the title to imagine himself deserving of it, yet far enough removed that it will likely never fall to him, so long as His Grace lives and marries and produces an heir of his own. He would not be pleased by anything that complicates the succession, or that draws fresh attention to old family matters best left undisturbed." "Do you think he would interfere in the investigation His Grace has begun?" "I think, Miss Whitmore, that you would be wise to trust no one in this house beyond myself, Polly, and His Grace himself, until we understand precisely what happened 30 years ago, and why someone found it necessary to burn a letter rather than simply file it away." Mrs. Fairweather's expression softened slightly. "But do not let this frighten you from your purpose. The truth has a way of surfacing eventually, however deeply it has been buried, and I do not believe you were sent to this house by mere accident." That night, unable to sleep, Eleanor found herself once more in the long gallery, standing before the small portrait of Lady Margaret, studying the painted face for some clue, some resemblance, some answer that might explain the tangled threads connecting a dead girl, a vanished companion, and a necklace that had traveled a path neither of them yet understood. The moonlight fell through the tall windows, illuminating the portrait in silver light, and for a long moment Eleanor felt an odd kinship with the young woman in the painting, both of them caught, in their own separate ways, in a story larger than themselves. "Whatever happened to you," she whispered to the silent portrait, "I intend to find out, for your sake, and for my mother's, and perhaps for my own as well." Behind her, unseen in the shadows of the gallery entrance, the Duke of Blackthorne stood watching, having come upon her by chance during his own restless wandering through the sleeping house, and found himself unable to interrupt the quiet moment, moved by a tenderness in Eleanor's voice that he had not expected to witness, and that stirred something within him he had believed long since buried alongside his sister. He withdrew quietly before she could notice him, though the image of her standing before Margaret's portrait, moonlight silvering her hair, would remain with him long after he returned to his own chambers, another thread woven into the growing tapestry of feeling he could no longer pretend did not exist. In the days that followed, the investigation that had begun as an accusation would carry them both toward a truth neither could yet imagine, one that would upend everything they believed about the past and about each other. The solicitor's reply arrived 9 days later, delivered by private messenger on a gray afternoon that matched the tension already settling over Blackthorne Hall. Eleanor learned of its arrival from Polly, who came rushing into the linen room, breathless with news gathered from the footman who had answered the door. "A letter, miss, from London, marked urgent, and His Grace has shut himself in his study with it since before luncheon. He has not even rung for tea." Eleanor set aside her mending, unable to concentrate further with her thoughts so fully consumed by what that letter might contain. She had scarcely seen the Duke in recent days, their brief and unexpected closeness in the study seeming, in the harsh light of following mornings, almost like something she had imagined. He had grown distant again, though not unkind, occupied by correspondence and estate matters and, she suspected, by the discomfort of having revealed so much of himself to a woman he had known scarcely a fortnight. Mr. Whitfield, meanwhile, had extended his visit far beyond the few days originally expected, and his presence had settled over the household like an unwelcome shadow. Eleanor had done her best to avoid him, but she felt his pale eyes upon her whenever their paths crossed, calculating and cold, and she had begun to suspect he was making inquiries of his own, quietly gathering information from staff members loyal enough to answer his questions without thinking to mention the conversations to Mrs. Fairweather. It was nearly evening when a summons came for Eleanor to attend the Duke in his study. She climbed the stairs with her heart in her throat, uncertain what news awaited her, and found him standing near the window, the solicitor's letter held loosely in one hand, his expression unreadable in the fading light. "Close the door, Miss Whitmore." She did as he asked, and waited in silence while he seemed to gather his thoughts, the letter trembling slightly in his grip. "The solicitor has found record of a settlement," he said finally. "Paid to a Catherine Ashworth, some 30 years past, at my mother's direction, on the condition that she leave Blackthorne immediately and never return, nor ever speak of the circumstances of her departure to any person, under threat of forfeiting the settlement entirely." Eleanor's chest tightened. "What circumstances, Your Grace, does the letter say?" "Not directly, but there is a second document referenced, a private letter my mother wrote to the solicitor some months before her own death, which he has enclosed here." The Duke held up a second smaller paper, his hand not quite steady. "I have read it 3 times already, Miss Whitmore, and I confess I still struggle to accept what it suggests. Please, Your Grace, tell me." He drew a breath, as though steadying himself for what he was about to say. "My mother writes that Catherine Ashworth was dismissed, not for any wrongdoing of her own, but because my mother discovered her in possession of information regarding my father, information that, if made public, would have brought disgrace upon this family. She does not specify what that information was, only that Catherine was paid handsomely to keep her silence and disappear entirely from our lives." "Blackmail," Eleanor said quietly. "Or something that resembled it closely enough that my mother felt it necessary to describe the payment as hush money, in her own words." The Duke set both letters down upon his desk, running a hand through his hair in evident frustration. "But there is more. My mother writes that Catherine did not go willingly, that she wept, and begged to be allowed to keep something of the household, some small token, before she left forever. And my mother, out of what she describes as a moment of misplaced pity, allowed her to take a piece of jewelry from the family collection, a sapphire necklace that had belonged to my grandmother before it was ever given to Margaret." Eleanor's hand rose instinctively to her throat. "The necklace was given to her, not stolen from Margaret's coffin at all. So it would seem. My mother must have had a second necklace made, nearly identical, for Margaret to wear in the years that followed, perhaps hoping to spare herself the guilt of having given away a family piece under such circumstances. And when Margaret died, it was the replica that was buried with her, not the original stone at all." He shook his head slowly. "I have spent 4 years believing a piece of my sister's grave had somehow been disturbed, when in truth, the true necklace never left this house's history at all. It simply followed Catherine Ashworth into whatever new life she built for herself, and eventually, it seems to you." The relief that flooded through Eleanor was almost dizzying. 4 years of unexplained shadow suddenly given shape and reason. Her mother had not stolen anything. She had been given the necklace, however unwillingly, as some small compensation for a silence she had been forced to keep. "What information did she hold?" Eleanor asked. "About your father, do you know?" "I do not, and I fear I may never learn it now, unless your mother left some record of her own, some letter or account among her possessions that might explain what she knew, and why my own mother judged it worth such considerable payment to keep buried." He looked at her then, something searching in his gray eyes. "Did she leave anything, Miss Whitmore? Papers, letters, anything at all that might shed light on this?" Eleanor considered the question carefully, casting her mind back over the sparse belongings her mother had left behind, the small cottage sold soon after her death to cover its final debts, the few trunks of clothing and household items that Eleanor had carried with her from place to place ever since. "There was a small wooden box," she said slowly, "that I have never opened. My mother kept it locked, and I never found the key among her things. I assumed it held nothing of importance, sentimental trinkets perhaps, and I did not wish to force the lock out of respect for her privacy. Do you still have it?" "Yes, Your Grace. It is among my belongings here, in the servants' wing." The Duke's expression sharpened with sudden purpose. "I would ask you to bring it to me, if you are willing. Whatever it contains may hold the answer we have both been searching for." Eleanor hesitated only a moment before nodding. "I will fetch it now, Your Grace." She hurried from the study, her mind racing with possibility and apprehension in equal measure, and returned within a quarter hour carrying a small, weathered wooden box, its surface worn smooth by years of handling, its brass lock tarnished with age. She set it upon the Duke's desk, and together they studied it in silence for a long moment, both aware that whatever lay within might finally answer questions that had haunted this house, and Eleanor's own understanding of her mother, for far longer than either of them had known. Shall I send for a locksmith? The Duke asked. No, Eleanor said, surprising herself with the firmness in her own voice. I think I would rather force it myself, Your Grace, if you do not object. Whatever truth it holds, I believe I owe it to my mother to be the one who finally uncovers it. He nodded, understanding evident in his expression, and fetched a small iron letter opener from his desk drawer, offering it to her without a word. Eleanor's hands trembled slightly as she worked the thin blade beneath the tarnished lock, the old wood creaking in protest, until at last, with a soft splintering crack, the lid gave way. Inside lay a small bundle of letters, tied with faded ribbon, and beneath them, a single folded document that, even in the dim evening light, bore the unmistakable seal of a magistrate's office. The Duke leaned forward, his breath catching. Miss Whitmore, I believe we have found precisely what we came searching for. Eleanor's fingers hovered above the letters, suddenly reluctant to disturb secrets her mother had kept locked away for the whole of Eleanor's life. But reluctance, she knew, would serve no one now, not after so many years of silence, not after a family had buried grief upon grief without ever understanding its true source. She untied the ribbon and began, at last, to read. The first letter was brief, written in a hand Eleanor recognized instantly as her mother's, though younger and less steady than the writing she remembered from later years. It was addressed to no one in particular, more a private account than a true letter, and it described, in careful and guarded language, a night many years past when Catherine Ashworth had come upon the late Duke, the father of the man now standing beside Eleanor, in the small stone folly at the edge of the estate gardens, engaged in what the letter described only as a private meeting of a nature that would have destroyed his marriage and his standing had it become known. Eleanor glanced up at the Duke, uncertain whether to continue, but his face had gone pale and still, and he nodded for her to go on. The second letter, dated some weeks later, was addressed directly to the old Duchess, though it seemed never to have been sent, for it remained folded within the box alongside the others. In it, Catherine described how she had been summoned before the Duchess and accused of spreading gossip, though she insisted she had told no one, had breathed not a word of what she witnessed to any soul in the household. She wrote of her fear, of the Duchess's cold fury, and of the ultimatum she had been given: accept a settlement and leave Blackthorne forever, or be dismissed without character and without wages, left to find her way in the world with nothing but suspicion trailing behind her. She had no choice, Eleanor murmured, reading the desperate, careful words her mother had set down so long ago. She was punished for a truth she never even spoke aloud. The Duke said nothing, his jaw tight, his eyes fixed on the folded magistrate's document that still lay unread at the bottom of the box. Eleanor set aside the letters and lifted it carefully, unfolding the stiff, official paper. It was a record of birth, dated some months after Catherine's departure from Blackthorne Hall, registering the arrival of a daughter, born to Catherine Ashworth, father unnamed upon the parish record. Eleanor's hands began to shake. Your Grace, she said slowly, the words feeling strange and heavy in her mouth. This record, it is dated 8 months after the settlement your mother described. The Duke crossed the room in 3 swift strides and took the document from her trembling hands, reading it himself in the candlelight, his expression shifting from confusion to something far more complicated as understanding dawned. Eleanor, he said, and she noticed, distantly, that it was the first time he had used her given name, rather than the formal address he had maintained since her arrival. Do you understand what this suggests? I am not certain I wish to, she whispered, though the truth was already forming, cold and undeniable, in the pit of her stomach. You believe your father to be my father as well. I do not know what to believe, he said, though his voice had grown gentle in a way she had never heard from him before, stripped entirely of the coldness that had defined their first encounter. But the timing, the secrecy, the settlement paid to ensure her silence, all of it points toward a possibility I confess I had not once considered, not until this very moment. Eleanor sank into the chair before the desk, her legs suddenly unable to support her. If it were true, if her mother's silence had been bought not merely to protect a private indiscretion, but to conceal the birth of a child born from it, then everything Eleanor had believed about her own quiet, humble upbringing was built upon a foundation far more complicated than she could have ever imagined. She was not simply a seamstress's daughter who had stumbled by chance into a great house. She might be, however unacknowledged, however hidden by decades of careful silence, a daughter of Blackthorne herself. If this is true, she said slowly, forcing the words past the tightness in her throat, then you and I would be, in some fashion, connected by blood. The Duke was silent for a long moment, and Eleanor watched a complicated array of emotions move across his face: shock, and something that looked almost like grief, and beneath it all, a flicker of something warmer that seemed to trouble him even as it surfaced. "Half-siblings," he said finally, testing the word as though it tasted strange upon his tongue. Should this prove true? Eleanor thought suddenly, unbidden, of the moment in the study only days before, of the warmth that had passed between them in the firelight, the feeling she had not allowed herself to name. If this record spoke true, that warmth had been something else entirely, something far more complicated than either of them had imagined, and the realization settled over her like a physical weight, cold and unwelcome. "We must be certain," she said, gathering what composure she could manage, "before either of us allows this document to reshape everything we believe about ourselves. A parish record alone, with no name given for the father, proves connection to no one in particular. It may be coincidence of timing, nothing more. You are right, of course." The Duke set the document down carefully, though his hand lingered upon it, as though reluctant to release something so significant. "We will need further proof. My father's own correspondence from that period, perhaps, or the testimony of anyone still living who might have witnessed what passed between Catherine and my father that night in the Folly. And if the proof confirms it—" He looked at her then, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the candlelight flickering between them, casting long shadows across the walls of the study, where so many secrets had already come to light that evening. "Then we shall face that truth together," he said finally, "as I believe we have faced everything else since the day you arrived at Blackthorne. Whatever else this discovery changes, Miss Whitmore, I do not believe it changes my resolve to see this matter through to its true and final end." Eleanor nodded, though her heart remained heavy with uncertainty. The small wooden box opened before her, its secrets finally spilled out into the candlelit room, secrets that had waited nearly 30 years to be uncovered, and that now threatened to rewrite the very shape of who she believed herself to be. Sleep did not come easily to Eleanor that night, nor, she suspected, to the Duke of Blackthorne, whose light she could see still burning beneath his study door long after the rest of the household had retired. She rose before dawn, unable to bear the stillness of her narrow room a moment longer, and made her way down to the kitchens, where the cook was already stirring the banked fire, preparing for the day ahead. The older woman glanced up as Eleanor entered, offering a kind, knowing look that suggested rumors of the previous evening's discoveries had already begun to travel, however carefully the Duke and Eleanor had tried to keep the matter private. "Trouble sleeping, miss?" "Too much on my mind, I am afraid." The cook said nothing further, only pressed a cup of warm tea into Eleanor's hands and returned to her work, and Eleanor sat at the edge of the great kitchen table, grateful for the simple kindness, letting the warmth of the cup ground her against the storm of thoughts still circling in her mind. By mid-morning, a second letter had arrived from London, this one addressed not to the Duke but to Eleanor herself, forwarded through the solicitor's office at the Duke's own request. She opened it with trembling hands in the privacy of her small room, and found within it a response to inquiries the Duke had evidently sent the previous night, working long past midnight to chase down whatever proof might settle the question hanging over them both. The solicitor had located, among the late Duke's private papers, a series of letters exchanged between the old Duke and a family friend, a colonel stationed abroad, in which the old Duke confided, with evident shame, an entanglement he had formed some years prior with a woman in the village adjoining the estate, a widow by the name of Mary Hollis, entirely unconnected to Catherine Ashworth or to Blackthorne Hall's own household staff. The dates aligned precisely with the period in question, and the old Duke's letters made clear, with painful specificity, that it was this village widow, not Catherine, who had borne him a child that same year, a child he had provided for quietly through a separate settlement entirely, one the solicitor had only now uncovered while searching for records relevant to Eleanor's own case. Eleanor read the letter 3 times before the meaning fully settled over her, relief flooding through her chest so suddenly that she had to sit upon the edge of her bed to steady herself. She was not the old Duke's daughter. The timing of her mother's departure and her own birth had been nothing more than a painful coincidence, 2 separate scandals unfolding within the same household during the same troubled season, tangled together only by the accident of dates upon a parish record. She hurried to find the Duke at once, discovering him in the breakfast room, a plate of untouched food before him, his eyes shadowed with the same sleeplessness that had plagued her own night. "Your Grace." She held out the letter, unable to keep the relief from her voice. "The solicitor has found the truth. It was not my mother. Your father's indiscretion involved another woman entirely, a widow from the village, and the timing of my birth was nothing more than an unfortunate coincidence." He took the letter from her and read it swiftly, his shoulders visibly loosening as he reached its conclusion, and when he looked up at her again, something had shifted entirely in his expression, the careful distance he had maintained since the previous night's revelation, dissolving into something far warmer, far more open than she had yet seen from him. "Then we are not siblings," he said quietly. "No," Eleanor agreed, her own voice unsteady. "We are not." A silence stretched between them, charged with everything neither had allowed themselves to feel during the long, uncertain hours since the parish record had first come to light. Eleanor found herself unable to look away from him, from the relief so plainly written across his features, relief that seemed to mirror something rising in her own chest, something she had tried desperately to suppress the night before out of fear it could never be permitted to exist. "I must confess something to you," the Duke said finally, setting the letter down upon the table with careful precision. "When I believed we might be connected by blood, my grief was not only for the loss of a possibility I had not realized I wanted, until the moment it seemed forever out of reach." Eleanor's breath caught. "Your Grace, Nathaniel," he said, "I think, given everything we have shared these past weeks, you might call me by my given name, if you are willing." "Nathaniel," she repeated softly, testing the sound of it, and something in his expression softened further still at hearing it spoken from her lips. Their conversation was interrupted, however, before either could say more, by the sound of hurried footsteps in the corridor, and Mrs. Fairweather appeared in the doorway, her face flushed and anxious. "Your Grace, Miss Whitmore, forgive the intrusion, but Mr. Whitfield has been asking questions below stairs since dawn, and I fear he has learned something of last night's discoveries. He has ordered his carriage prepared, though he has not yet departed." The Duke's expression darkened immediately, the warmth of moments before giving way to sharp concern. "What has he learned?" "I cannot say for certain, Your Grace, but one of the younger footmen mentioned overhearing talk of a parish record, and of a child born under scandalous circumstances. I fear Mr. Whitfield may intend to use whatever he has pieced together to his own advantage, particularly if he believes there is any question at all regarding Miss Whitmore's parentage that might cast doubt upon the succession, or embarrass this family before it can be properly explained." Eleanor's stomach twisted with fresh alarm. If Whitfield had learned only the first half of the story, the suspicion without its resolution, he might spread rumors throughout London society that could damage the Duke's reputation, and her own, regardless of the truth the solicitor's letter had so recently confirmed. "We must speak with him before he departs," the Duke said, already moving toward the door. "Whatever partial truth he has gathered, he will hear the whole of it from me directly, rather than piecing together gossip from frightened footmen." They found Mr. Whitfield in the entrance hall, his traveling case already being loaded into his waiting carriage, a thin, satisfied smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he watched them approach. "Cousin," he said smoothly, "and Miss Whitmore, I understand congratulations may be in order, or perhaps condolences, depending upon how one views a scandal 30 years buried finally clawing its way back into the light. You will speak plainly, Whitfield, or not at all," the Duke said, his voice hard with barely restrained anger. "Plainly, then. I understand there is some question regarding Miss Whitmore's parentage, connected to my late uncle's private affairs, and that a parish record has surfaced suggesting a connection to this family that would prove most inconvenient, should it become widely known." Whitfield's smile widened. "I wonder how London might react to learning that the Duke of Blackthorne has been harboring, and by all appearances growing rather fond of, a seamstress who might well be his own half-sister." "The matter has been resolved," the Duke said flatly. "Miss Whitmore's birth has no connection whatsoever to my father. The timing was coincidental, nothing more, as any thorough investigation would have revealed, had you troubled yourself to seek the whole truth, rather than seizing upon rumor for your own purposes." Whitfield's smile faltered slightly, though he recovered his composure quickly enough. "How convenient, that the truth should resolve so neatly in your favor." "It is not convenient, cousin, it is simply true. And I would remind you that spreading half-formed rumors regarding this family's private affairs, particularly rumors you know to be incomplete, would constitute a slander I would not hesitate to pursue through every legal means available to me." The Duke's voice had gone cold and precise, every inch the authority his title afforded him. "You came to this house hoping to find some scandal you might use against me, some crack in the succession you could exploit to your own advantage. You have found nothing of the sort, and I would strongly advise you to return to London and trouble this family no further." For a long moment, Whitfield held his ground, his pale eyes flicking between the Duke and Eleanor with calculating coldness. But something in the Duke's unwavering certainty seemed finally to convince him that whatever leverage he had hoped to find here had slipped entirely beyond his reach, and with a stiff, resentful bow, he turned and climbed into his waiting carriage without another word, the vehicle rattling away down the drive moments later in a cloud of dust. Eleanor let out a breath she had not realized she was holding. "Do you think he will spread rumors regardless, Your Grace? Whatever the truth may be, he may try," Nathaniel admitted, turning to face her fully now that the immediate threat had departed. "But rumor rarely survives long against plain documented truth, and I intend to see that the full account, properly recorded and witnessed, is available should anyone question it further." He studied her for a long moment, something gentle returning to his expression. "I am sorry, Eleanor, that your arrival at this house has brought you nothing but accusation and scandal, and now the threat of gossip besides. You deserved a far kinder welcome than the one I gave you. I have found more truth here in these past weeks than I found in the whole of my life before it," Eleanor said softly. "I cannot regret that, whatever difficulties came alongside it." They stood together in the entrance hall, the afternoon light spilling warm through the tall windows, and for the first time since her arrival, Eleanor felt something settle within her, a sense that whatever remained to be discovered about her mother's past, about the true circumstances of Catherine Ashworth's departure from this house so many years before, she would not have to face it alone. "There remains one matter still unresolved," Nathaniel said quietly. "We know now who your father was not. We do not yet know who he truly was, nor what became of your mother in the years between her departure from Blackthorne and her eventual settlement in the cottage where you were raised. If you are willing, I should like to help you uncover the whole of that story, whatever it may hold." "I would like that very much," Eleanor said, and meant it entirely, surprised by how naturally the words came, how thoroughly her fear of this house and its secrets had transformed, in the span of only a few short weeks, into something that felt remarkably like hope. They began that very afternoon, retreating once more to the study where so many discoveries had already unfolded, and together they pored over the remaining letters from the small wooden box, searching for any further clue as to where Catherine Ashworth had gone after leaving Blackthorne, and who she might have married in the years before Eleanor's birth. Buried among the bundle, beneath the letters they had already read, Eleanor found a final, shorter note, water-stained and difficult to read, addressed to her mother from a solicitor in a neighboring county, confirming receipt of the settlement and wishing her well in her forthcoming marriage to a Mr. Henry Whitmore, a modest but respectable clerk of good character. "Henry Whitmore," Eleanor read aloud, her voice unsteady. "My father, the man I always believed to be my father, in truth." "Perhaps he was," Nathaniel said gently. "A father is not only the man who provides the blood, Eleanor, but the man who raises the child, who gives his name freely and without condition. If Henry Whitmore married your mother knowing she carried a child not his own, and gave you his name regardless, that is no small thing. That is, I think, a truer measure of fatherhood than the accident of birth alone." Eleanor considered this, turning the water-stained letter over in her hands, and felt something ease within her that she had not realized remained so tightly wound. She had spent her whole life believing herself the daughter of a quiet clerk who had died when she was very young, a man she barely remembered beyond the vague warmth of being lifted onto broad shoulders as a small child. If Henry Whitmore had chosen to be her father despite knowing the truth of her birth, that choice mattered more, she decided, than any parish record or old scandal ever could. "Do you know what became of him?" Nathaniel asked. "Your father, I mean Henry Whitmore. He died when I was 5 years of age. A fever took him, quite suddenly. I remember very little of him now, only fragments. His laugh, the smell of pipe tobacco, the way he used to carry me on his shoulders through the village on market days." Eleanor smiled faintly at the memory, bittersweet as it was. "My mother never remarried after his death. She raised me alone, taking in sewing work to support us both, and never once spoke of Blackthorne, or of any life before the small cottage I grew up in. She must have carried a great weight of silence all those years," Nathaniel said quietly. "To protect you, I imagine, from precisely the kind of scandal that nearly overtook us both last night. I begin to understand her more with each secret we uncover," Eleanor admitted. "I used to think her quiet nature simply her temperament, a woman content with small, simple things. Now I wonder how much of that quiet was armor, built carefully over years to shield a truth she dared not speak aloud, not even to her own daughter." They spent the remainder of that afternoon in companionable quiet, sorting through the last of the letters, piecing together as much of Catherine Ashworth's story as the fragile paper would allow. And by the time the light began to fade toward evening, something had settled firmly between them, an understanding forged not only through shared grief and shared mystery, but through the simple, steady comfort of two people who had chosen, again and again, to face difficult truths together, rather than turn away from them. "I owe you an apology," Nathaniel said, as Eleanor gathered the letters to return them carefully to their box. "Not only for the courtyard, though that remains foremost among my regrets, but for every moment since when I allowed suspicion to color how I treated you, when I ought instead to have trusted the plain honesty you showed me from the very first." "You have more than made amends, Your Grace," Eleanor said, though a small smile touched her lips at the formality, given how far they had traveled together since that first frightening encounter. "Nathaniel," she corrected herself softly. He reached across the desk and, with a gentleness that surprised her, took her hand in his own, his thumb tracing lightly across her knuckles in a gesture that spoke far more than words could have managed. "Whatever remains to be uncovered about your mother's past, Eleanor, know that you need not face it as a stranger in this house any longer. Whatever you are to me, sister, I now know you are not. Friend, I hope you already consider me. And perhaps, in time, something more besides. You belong here now, however this story concludes." Eleanor's heart swelled with an emotion she had not allowed herself to name until that very moment, standing in the fading evening light with her hand held gently in his, the mystery of the necklace nearly resolved, and a new, uncertain hope blooming quietly in its place. 3 weeks passed before the final piece of the puzzle found its way to Blackthorne Hall, arriving not by letter this time, but in the person of an elderly woman who appeared at the servants' entrance one gray morning, leaning heavily upon a wooden cane, asking to speak with whoever now held authority over the household. Her name was Agnes Farrow, and she had once served as a lady's maid to the old Duchess, decades before, in the very years when Catherine Ashworth had walked these same halls. Word of her arrival reached Eleanor first through Polly, breathless with the news, and Eleanor hurried to fetch Nathaniel from his study, before making her way down to the small parlor where Mrs. Fairweather had settled their unexpected visitor with tea and a warm blanket against the morning chill. "I read of the old Duchess's passing some years back," Agnes explained. "Once introductions had been made, and Nathaniel had taken a seat across from her, and more recently, word reached me through my niece, who still has connections among the staff here, that questions were being asked about a woman named Catherine Ashworth. I thought it high time an old woman set right what should have been said plainly 30 years ago." Eleanor leaned forward, scarcely daring to breathe. "You knew my mother?" "I knew her well, child. We were close as sisters, in the years we served together in this house." Agnes's weathered face creased with old sorrow. "And I have carried a guilt these 30 years that I never once found the courage to correct." "What guilt, Mrs. Farrow?" Nathaniel asked gently. "It was not your father who Catherine discovered in the folly that night, Your Grace, begging your pardon for speaking so plainly of matters better left buried. It was your father's own brother, your uncle, come to visit from London, engaged in an affair with a woman of the village entirely separate from the one your solicitor uncovered. Catherine witnessed them together by chance, said not a word to a living soul, yet somehow the old Duchess came to believe otherwise, perhaps warned by a jealous rival among the staff, or by the uncle himself seeking to protect his own reputation by casting suspicion elsewhere." The Duke's expression had gone very still. "My uncle, not my father at all. Your uncle passed some 15 years ago now, God rest him, and I suppose there seemed little purpose in disturbing old scandal once he was gone. But Catherine paid dearly for a truth she never even spoke, dismissed from her position, her reputation quietly ruined among anyone who might have offered her honest employment thereafter, all to protect a man who was never even her mistress's own husband." Agnes shook her head slowly, old grief plain upon her weathered features. "I should have spoken sooner. I have thought of Catherine often through the years, wondered what became of her, whether she found happiness after everything this house cost her." "She found a measure of it," Eleanor said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "She married a kind man, and raised a daughter, and though her later years were quiet and modest, I do not believe she was unhappy. Not entirely." "You must be her daughter then." Agnes studied Eleanor with sudden warm recognition. "You have her eyes, child. I see it now that I look closely." Catherine had just that same steadiness about her, even in her most frightened moments. Eleanor felt tears gather unexpectedly at the old woman's words. A connection to her mother she had not anticipated finding in a stranger's memory, decades removed from the woman Eleanor herself had known only as a quiet, careful presence bent over her sewing by candlelight. "Thank you," Eleanor said, "for coming forward, for telling the truth, even after so many years. It was owed, child, long overdue, but owed all the same." Agnes reached across and patted Eleanor's hand with a gentleness that reminded Eleanor, achingly, of her own mother's touch. "I am glad to see her daughter has found her way to kindness, wherever life has carried you since." The old woman stayed through luncheon, sharing further memories of Catherine, small details Eleanor treasured, her mother's fondness for wildflowers gathered from the estate meadows, her quiet laugh, the careful, patient way she had always approached her needlework even as a young woman, long before circumstance had made such skill a necessity rather than a simple pleasure. By the time Agnes departed that afternoon, arrangements made for a modest pension to be sent to her in gratitude for finally setting the record straight, Eleanor felt as though she had recovered some small, precious piece of her mother that she had not known was missing. That evening, Nathaniel found her once more in the long gallery, standing before Margaret's portrait as she so often did now, though her expression, he noted, had lost much of the sorrow that had shadowed it during her earlier visits. "The full truth, at last," he said, coming to stand beside her. "Yes." Eleanor looked up at him, something settled and peaceful in her gaze that had not been there since her arrival at Blackthorne. "Your family owes my mother a debt it can never fully repay, but I find I do not carry the anger I might have expected, learning all of this. Only sorrow, for what she endured, and gratitude, that the truth has finally come to light. I intend to see her name properly restored," Nathaniel said. "A record placed among the family archives correcting the old account, so that no future generation need wonder at the gaps in the ledgers, or the burnt fragments of old letters. Catherine Ashworth deserves to be remembered honestly, not erased by another family's shame." "Thank you," Eleanor said quietly. "That means more to me than I can properly express." They stood together before the portrait a while longer, the evening light fading slowly through the gallery windows, and Nathaniel turned to face her fully, something solemn and hopeful mingling in his expression. "Eleanor, I have thought of little else these past weeks besides the truth of your mother's story and my own family's part in her suffering, but I have thought also, more than I perhaps should admit, of you. Of the courage you have shown through every difficult revelation, the grace with which you met accusation and scandal and uncertainty alike, and the quiet steadiness that reminds me, more with each passing day, of everything good I believed had left this house alongside my sister." Eleanor's heart quickened, though she said nothing, sensing he had more yet to say. "I do not offer this lightly, nor without full understanding of the difference in our stations, and the difficulties such a difference might present." He reached for her hand, holding it carefully within his own. "But I find I cannot imagine this house, or my own life within it, continuing on without you now that you have become so thoroughly woven into both. Eleanor Whitmore, I am asking whether you might consider remaining at Blackthorne, not as a seamstress in my household, but as its mistress, if you would have me." For a long moment, Eleanor could not speak, the weight of the question settling over her with a warmth that spread slowly through her entire body, chasing away the last remnants of fear and uncertainty that had lingered since that first, frightening morning in the courtyard. "I came to this house believing myself accused of theft," she said finally, a smile breaking across her face despite the tears gathering in her eyes. "I never imagined I would leave it, should I choose to stay, having found not only the truth of my mother's past, but a future I could never have dreamed of asking for. Is that a yes, Eleanor?" "It is," she said, laughing now through her tears. "Very much a yes." He drew her gently into his arms, and for the first time since his sister's death, Nathaniel Ashford, Duke of Blackthorne, felt something in his chest that had been closed and guarded for 4 long years, finally begin to open once more, grief giving way, slowly and carefully, to a hope he had not believed himself capable of feeling again. Their engagement was announced within the month, much to the delight of the household staff, who had watched the whole strange, tangled story unfold with growing affection for the seamstress who had arrived under such clouded circumstances, and won, in the end, both the truth of her own history and the heart of a man none among them had seen smile so freely in years. Mrs. Fairweather wept openly at the news, declaring she had known from the very first morning, watching Eleanor stand her ground in that tense courtyard confrontation, that there was something remarkable about the young woman who would not be cowed by a duke's temper. Polly could scarcely contain her excitement, already imagining herself promoted to lady's maid once the wedding took place. Mr. Whitfield, upon receiving formal notice of the engagement, sent only a curt, brief letter of grudging congratulation, and made no further attempt to trouble the household, having learned, perhaps, that whatever scandal he had hoped to uncover had transformed instead into a story of resilience and restored honor that left no room for the kind of gossip he had once hoped to wield. On a bright morning in early autumn, Eleanor stood once more in the long gallery, this time not alone, but beside Nathaniel, both of them gazing up at the small portrait of Lady Margaret that had watched over so much of their unfolding story. Around Eleanor's throat hung the sapphire necklace, its true history finally understood. No longer a symbol of suspicion and accusation, but of a truth patiently uncovered, and a family's willingness, at last, to face its past honestly rather than bury it beneath further silence. "I think she would have liked you," Nathaniel said softly, studying his sister's painted face. Margaret had little patience for cowardice, and even less for cruelty disguised as propriety. "She would have admired how fiercely you held your ground against me, that first day in the courtyard." "I like to think she would have," Eleanor agreed, slipping her hand into his. "Perhaps in some fashion she led me here herself, a necklace finding its way home, after all these years, carrying with it a truth that needed finally to be spoken." Outside, the autumn sun spilled warm and golden across the gardens of Blackthorne Hall, and within its ancient walls, a house that had spent 4 long years shrouded in grief and silence began, slowly and surely, to fill once more with the sound of laughter. The wedding took place in early winter, in the small stone chapel on the estate grounds, its windows frosted delicately at the edges, candles lighting every sill against the pale morning light. Eleanor wore a gown of soft ivory, simple in its design but exquisitely stitched, every seam sewn by her own hand in quiet hours over the preceding weeks, for she had insisted, gently but firmly, that no other seamstress would craft her wedding gown but herself. Mrs. Fairweather stood near the front of the small gathering, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief she had brought specifically for the occasion, having declared to anyone who would listen that she had known this match was destined from the very first tense morning in the courtyard. Polly, newly promoted to lady's maid as she had so long hoped, stood proudly at Eleanor's side throughout the morning's preparations, arranging her hair with careful, practiced hands, chattering happily about the future that lay ahead for them both within the household. Agnes Farrow had been invited as an honored guest, and she sat near the front of the chapel, leaning upon her cane, tears of quiet joy tracing the lines of her weathered face, as she watched Catherine Ashworth's daughter walk toward a future her own mother could scarcely have imagined for her, so many years before, when she had left Blackthorne in disgrace and sorrow. Nathaniel waited at the altar, dressed in fine dark clothing that could not entirely disguise the nervous energy evident in the set of his shoulders, his gray eyes fixed upon the chapel doors from the moment the first notes of music began to play. When Eleanor appeared at last, framed by pale winter light, something in his expression softened so completely that several among the gathered guests exchanged knowing smiles, recalling the cold, guarded man he had been only months before, and marveling at how thoroughly love had transformed him. The ceremony itself was brief and simple, exactly as Eleanor had requested, for she had never cared for grand spectacle, only for the quiet certainty of the vows exchanged, and the warm weight of Nathaniel's hand in her own as they spoke the words that would bind their futures together. When at last the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, a cheer rose from the small gathering, and Eleanor found herself laughing through unexpected tears, overwhelmed by joy she had never dared imagine possible. Not during those first frightened days when she had believed herself accused of a crime she had never committed. A modest wedding breakfast followed in the great hall, tables laid with simple, hearty fare rather than the extravagant feasts such occasions often demanded, for both Eleanor and Nathaniel had agreed they wished their joy shared as fully with the household staff as with any guests of rank who might otherwise have been invited. The cook had outdone herself with a magnificent cake, and the servants who had watched Eleanor's strange, difficult arrival those months before now raised their glasses freely in celebration of the woman who had become, against every expectation, both their mistress and their friend. Later that afternoon, as the celebrations continued below, Eleanor slipped away briefly to the long gallery, drawn once more to Margaret's portrait, and found Nathaniel had followed her there, understanding, as he always seemed to now, precisely where her thoughts had wandered. "Married at last," he said softly, coming to stand beside her. "I keep thinking of that first morning," Eleanor admitted. "How frightened I was, how certain I felt that I had stumbled into some terrible misfortune, arriving at a grand house only to be accused of theft before I had even properly introduced myself." "I have never been more grateful for my own poor temper," Nathaniel said, a faint, rueful smile touching his lips. "Had I greeted you with proper courtesy that morning, I wonder how much longer it might have taken either of us to uncover the truth of that necklace, or of your mother's history, or indeed of everything that has passed between us since. Perhaps some truths require a little friction to bring them properly into the light," Eleanor said, leaning her head against his shoulder, as they both gazed up at the painted face of the young woman who had, in her own quiet way, brought them together across the span of so many buried years. I only wish Margaret could have known you, Nathaniel murmured. She would have delighted in your courage, and teased me mercilessly, I imagine, for how long it took me to recognize what stood plainly before me. Perhaps she does know, in whatever way such things may be known, Eleanor said gently. I like to believe our loved ones find some way of watching over the stories that matter most to us, even after they have gone. They stood together a while longer in comfortable silence, the sound of laughter and celebration drifting faintly up from the hall below, and when at last they returned to join their guests. Hand in hand, the house around them seemed, for the first time in 4 long years, entirely and completely alive again. Its grief transformed at last into something gentler, something that had learned, through patience and honesty, and the slow unraveling of an old and painful secret, how to make room once more for joy. In the years that followed, the sapphire necklace passed eventually to Eleanor and Nathaniel's own daughter, who wore it proudly upon her 16th birthday, never once burdened by the shadows that had once clung so tightly to its history, for her parents had made certain, long before she was old enough to ask, that she understood the whole of its story, the sorrow and the silence and the courage it had ultimately taken to bring the truth into the light, and the love that truth had, against every expectation, finally made possible. 5 years passed before Eleanor found herself standing once more before the small stone folly at the edge of the Blackthorne Gardens, the very building where a chance encounter, decades earlier, had set into motion the whole tangled chain of secrets that once threatened to unravel her family's happiness before it had properly begun. Her daughter Charlotte, now 4 years of age, ran ahead of her along the gravel path, chasing a pair of butterflies through the late summer flowers, with the boundless energy only a small child could possess. Eleanor watched her with quiet contentment, one hand resting against the gentle curve of her stomach, where a second child would arrive before the winter snows returned to the estate. Nathaniel found them there, as he so often did in the late afternoons, having finished his work with the estate steward for the day, and he came to stand beside Eleanor, watching their daughter's delighted pursuit of the butterflies, with the same soft warmth that had never fully left his expression since the day of their wedding. "She has your mother's eyes," he said, echoing words spoken to Eleanor herself, years before, by an old woman who had traveled far to set an old wrong finally right. "She has your stubbornness," Eleanor replied, laughing, "which I fear may prove the greater challenge as she grows older." They had built, in the years since their marriage, a life neither of them could have imagined during those first uncertain weeks of accusation and discovery. Nathaniel had thrown himself into estate matters with a renewed sense of purpose, restoring tenant cottages that had fallen into disrepair during his years of grief, establishing a small school for the children of the estate workers, determined that no family under his care should ever again suffer the kind of desperate silence that had once cost Catherine Ashworth so dearly. Eleanor, for her part, had continued her needlework, though now for pleasure rather than necessity, and had quietly established a small fund, administered through the estate, to assist women who found themselves in circumstances similar to those her own mother had once faced, unmarried, frightened, and without resources, offering them a measure of the dignity and support Catherine had been so cruelly denied. The portrait gallery had changed as well in the years since Eleanor's arrival. Margaret's small portrait had been moved to a place of greater prominence, no longer tucked uncertainly near the end of the row, and beside it now hung a new painting, commissioned shortly after Eleanor and Nathaniel's wedding, depicting Catherine Ashworth herself, recreated carefully from a small, faded miniature that Agnes Farrow had kept all these years and gifted to Eleanor upon learning of her friend's daughter's remarkable turn of fortune. It seemed only right, Nathaniel had insisted, that the woman whose silence had cost her so much should finally take her rightful place among the family whose secrets she had unknowingly carried for so long. "Mama, look," Charlotte called from further down the path, holding up a small blue wildflower she had gathered among the grass. "It matches my necklace." Eleanor smiled, glancing down at the small, delicate chain that hung around her daughter's neck, a modest replica crafted specially for the child, for the true sapphire necklace remained carefully kept until Charlotte came of age to wear it herself, understanding fully, by then, the weight and meaning of its history. "It does indeed," Eleanor agreed, crouching down to admire the small flower her daughter had found. "Your grandmother loved wildflowers very much, you know. She used to gather them from the meadows near her own home, long before either of us were born." "Did you know her, Mama?" "I did, though not nearly long enough," Eleanor said softly, brushing a strand of hair from her daughter's face. "But I have learned a great deal about her since, from people who loved her, and I hope, in time, to share all of it with you, so that you might know her too, in your own way." Charlotte considered this with the serious, careful expression only very young children could manage, before darting off once more after a fresh flutter of butterfly wings, her laughter carrying bright and clear across the summer garden. Nathaniel watched his daughter's retreating figure with evident fondness before turning back to Eleanor, offering his hand to help her rise from where she had crouched among the flowers. "Do you ever think of that first morning still, the courtyard, and the necklace, and my own poor temper?" "Often," Eleanor admitted, accepting his hand and allowing him to draw her gently to her feet. "Though the memory no longer frightens me as it once did, I think of it now more as the beginning of everything good that followed, rather than the misfortune I believed it to be at the time." "I owe that necklace a debt I can never properly repay," Nathaniel said, "for without it, I might never have looked closely enough at the woman standing before me to recognize what I was so nearly about to lose through my own foolish suspicion." "You were grieving," Eleanor said gently, as she had said so many times before in the years since. "Grief does not always leave room for clear thinking, particularly when it has been carried so long, and so silently, as yours had been." They walked together along the garden path, following the sound of Charlotte's continued laughter, the late summer sun warm upon their shoulders, and Eleanor found herself thinking, as she often did in quiet moments such as these, of her mother, of the years of silence Catherine had carried, the sorrow she had endured alone, never once speaking of the truth that might have finally been vindicated only through her daughter's own chance arrival at the very house that had once cast her out in disgrace. She thought too of Lady Margaret, of the portrait that watched so patiently over the long gallery, and of the strange winding path that had led a simple seamstress's necklace back to the very family it had first belonged to, carrying with it not scandal, in the end, but healing, for a house that had spent far too many years shrouded in unspoken grief. That evening, after Charlotte had been settled into her small bed with a story and a kiss, Eleanor found Nathaniel once more in his study, the same room where so many secrets had first come to light, though the space had changed considerably since those tense early days, filled now with warmth and comfortable clutter, books left open upon the desk, a small drawing Charlotte had made, propped proudly against the inkwell. "I received a letter today," Nathaniel said, looking up as she entered, "from the vicar in the village where your mother and Henry Whitmore were married. He has located the parish register, and confirms the date and circumstances precisely as the old solicitor's letter described. I thought you might like to have a copy, for your own records and perhaps to share with Charlotte someday, when she is old enough to understand the whole of her family's story." Eleanor took the letter gratefully, tears gathering unexpectedly at the corners of her eyes as she read the careful, official confirmation of a marriage that had given her not only a name, but a father's love, however brief the years they had shared together. "Thank you," she said softly, "for never once tiring of helping me uncover these small pieces of her, even after so many years. I promised you, that first evening in this very room, that we would face whatever truths remained to be found together," Nathaniel said, rising from his desk to draw her gently into his arms. "That promise has not changed, Eleanor, and it never shall, not so long as I have breath left to keep it." Outside, the last light of evening faded slowly over the gardens of Blackthorne Hall, over the meadows where wildflowers grew wild and unbothered, over the long gallery where two women, mother and daughter, finally hung side by side among a family that had learned, through hardship and honesty alike, the true cost of silence and the far greater reward of truth patiently, courageously uncovered. Mrs. Fairweather, now well advanced in years but still every bit as devoted to the household she had served for decades, joined them for tea the following morning, as had become her custom on quiet weekends when the estate business allowed for such leisure. She had watched Charlotte grow from infancy with the same fierce affection she had once shown Eleanor upon her own uncertain arrival, and she never failed to remind anyone within earshot that she had recognized, from that very first tense morning in the courtyard, the particular strength that would one day make Eleanor a fitting mistress of Blackthorne. "You should have seen her that first day," Mrs. Fairweather told Charlotte, who had climbed into her lap and was listening with wide, attentive eyes, as she always did when the housekeeper began one of her favorite stories. "Your father seized her wrist right there in the courtyard, so certain he had caught a thief, and your mother looked him dead in the eye, and told him plainly he was mistaken. I knew then she would not be easily frightened away, whatever grand title stood before her. Did Papa really think Mama stole the necklace?" Charlotte asked, glancing toward Eleanor with evident delight at the scandal of it. "He did," Eleanor confirmed, smiling at the memory that no longer carried any sting, though he learned rather quickly how mistaken he had been and spent a great many months afterward making amends for his poor judgment. "I am still making amends," Nathaniel said dryly, entering the room in time to catch the tail end of the story. and I suspect I shall be for the whole of our marriage, however patiently your mother insists otherwise." Charlotte giggled at this, sliding down from Mrs. Fairweather's lap to run and embrace her father's legs, and Nathaniel lifted her easily into his arms, pressing a kiss to the top of her head with the easy affection of a man who had, in the years since his sister's death, finally relearned how to love without fear of losing it all over again. Polly, too, remained a fixture of the household, having risen over the years from lady's maid to something closer to a trusted friend and confidant, and she often joined the family for these quiet mornings, bringing news of the village and gentle teasing that never failed to draw laughter from even the most serious of conversations. It seemed to Eleanor, watching them all gathered together in the warm morning light, that the house had become precisely what she had once feared it could never be. Not a place of cold suspicion and buried grief, but a true home, filled with laughter and honesty, and the steady, patient work of people who had chosen, again and again, to trust one another with the truth. Later that day, as autumn approached once more and the gardens began their slow transformation toward winter, Eleanor walked alone through the long gallery, pausing as she always did before the portraits of Margaret and Catherine, hanging now side by side in quiet dignity. She thought of how far the necklace had traveled, from a young girl's 16th birthday, through grief and scandal and 30 years of careful silence, into her own mother's keeping, and finally back to the family it had first belonged to, carrying with it not only truth, but the beginning of a love neither she nor Nathaniel had dared to hope for. She thought, too, of all the women like her mother who had suffered similar silences, forced by circumstance and fear, into lives lived quietly at the margins of grander stories, and she felt a fresh resolve settle within her to continue the work she had begun, ensuring that no woman under Blackthorne's care would ever again face such a choice alone. And around the neck of a young girl sleeping soundly in her bed down the corridor, a small blue stone caught the last rays of fading sunlight through her window, a humble echo of the necklace that had once demanded a stranger's explanation in a cold courtyard, and had instead delivered, across the span of years and secrets and grief, nothing less than an entire family's healing.